discovered that the logic that we presented, the logic of sort of cascading aftershocks, is still highly relevant at this time and age. We started from a very simple hypothesis, really, and that is that deep economic crisis can lead to fundamental change. And one can think of the crisis of the 1930s, one can think of the crisis of the 1970s, early 1980s, and in retrospect we could see that the world truly changes in the way we govern our societies and economies. So out of the Great Depression came a period of what is sometimes called embedded liberalism. And what for Europe is special for this period is the creation of welfare states and more European integration. So these are the two critical institutional innovations of the post-war period. Now, when we moved to the 1970s and early 1980s, there was the crisis of stagflation, and this gave rise to what we can call, and it's not a pejorative term, the regime of neoliberalism. And here, the welfare state and the European Union as well came to be seen as a bit of a problem against market flexibility. So the obvious question that we pose to Lucas and the other 23 authors in the book is, now we have this great recession in the early 21st century, will we see a new regime, and what will happen to the welfare state and what will happen to the EU? What is important to emphasize with these three crises is what was the goal after which a new regime came anchored. And I think with respect to the Great Depression and obviously the Second World War, the real emphasis of the post-war institution building was stability. There was so much chaos and destruction in the 1930s and over the war that we needed institutions to stabilize the economy. And we were very lucky that the economy grew tremendously, but that was not the issue. This became more the issue of the 1970s and 1980s. Our systems became more rigid, and there was a true need for flexibility. So the goal shifted from stability to flexibility. And now the question is, these institutions, the welfare states and the EU, that render stability in the first place, that also serve some flexibility, but maybe not enough, what will they do in the post-crisis period? And will they become, this is the big newspaper articles these days, will they become the first crisis casualties of today? Now what we've seen over the past 3 years is sort of a cascade of aftershocks, and I've listed here 10, but you can think of 10 others, but these are the obvious ones. There's an element of deglobalization, especially in the financial market. Maybe financial renationalization is not per se a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when it impacts on the real economy. Now obviously everywhere in Europe, especially in Greece and Ireland, there's a huge unemployment crisis, and we don't know how long it's going to take. There was already a pension crisis along the way, but with the new financial context, the pension crisis is likely to worsen. There's a fiscal crisis in the state, especially in Greece, with higher deficits. You know, a deficit of 6% may not be a problem. When it reaches over 12%, it is a very serious problem. Then there is a need for cuts, and there will be social unrest against retrenchment. Now, with all these sort of destabilizing factors, we are very likely to see a relatively long period of relatively low growth. And the core of that problem has to do with the fact that there is too much systemic debt in the economy. Systemic debt is the aggregate of private and public debt. And there are no obvious growth drivers like the ICT revolution of the 1980s and 1990s abound. Then we have seen, which is not covered in the book, we've seen the sort of the cascade of aftershocks leading to the sovereign debt crisis, especially in the current account deficit countries. And there's an obvious shift, we've seen it in Seoul, of an accelerated power shift to the BRIC countries. And now we're facing a currency war between China and the US, and maybe the EU will get some of the slack of that. Along the way, there are all kinds of mostly negative, but sometimes positive feedback mechanisms that can help economic and political stability. And I would very much like to emphasize the issue of political stability. But let's first look at the diagnosis of the crisis. And basically, I'm not again, neoliberalism for me is not a pejorative term, it's a way of thinking that we sort of developed in the 1970s and 1980s in response to the real rigidities in our economies. But the argument can be made that neoliberalism went too far. We haven't seen the huge transformation of the role and the size of international financial markets, and this has been hugely underrated. I think in the academic profession, especially in economics, there was the hypothesis of efficient markets, sub-disciplinary silos, international trade economics had little to do with financial economics, which is usually taught at the business school, and there has been an increasing mathematization of the economics profession. Financial regulation was relatively lax and very fragmentary. Again, this goes to show the underratedness of the transformation of international financial markets. Lenient monetary policy, especially in the US, and then China's rise as the world's largest exporter, and then the US with lenient monetary policy as the largest debtor economy. This led to massive lending, sort of privatized Keynesianism through your credit cards, as it were, which led to pro-cyclical economic development. In the year 2005, everything seemed fine, but the world was already at a huge disbalance, and it's sort of like the perfect storm. You don't know what's coming next, and then you only need a little bit of a tipping point, and this was the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, and the world economy gets a heart attack. Now, if we transpose this lesson to the EU, in retrospect, it's very easy to see that EU and the Stability and Growth Pact was very incoherent. With respect to the Stability Pact, it's not a failure of enforcement vis-à-vis Greece, maybe, but this doesn't account the situation for Spain, Ireland, and Portugal. So the basic lesson is that macro stability is much, much more than inflation targeting and budgetary discipline. And the EU regime in this respect was blind to the current account competitiveness imbalances in Europe. Because political intervention all the time was seen as an economic distortion. And now we know that the Eurozone, it's very, very difficult, needs some kind of fiscal policy, at least a safety net. And there was also a complete divorce between the negative rule-based stability regime of EU and the Growth Pact and the social investment agenda, which sort of underlined the Lisbon agenda, but which never came to full fruition. Now, if we look back over the past 2 years, we can say there are two phases of crisis management. One, the first phase was some kind of Keynesian fire brigade management, and in fact, it was hugely successful through domestic automatic stabilization with mild fiscal stimulus, not too much, but this wasn't necessary because there are many stabilizers in place. I think the ECB, under the helm of КРИСΗ, was very important, acted very astutely compared to political leaders, and in retrospect, I think one should say that